I.S.U.P.K. 1 West, I.S.U.P.K. started 1 West 125th Street, Harlem, New York. Under Commander Jimmy YAHANNA, we here for the Midwest Fire Weekend. Get a Most High in hand.
That's right.
Give me a Howard Shah in hand. Good Commander General YAHANNA in hand.
That's right.
Panama Pod, the Chicago crew in hand.
That's right.
You understand? We here for the how colonization divided Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans lecture. Before we go into the actual lecture, I want to give a little insight as to what we'll be talking about. So like if we can get just in the background just a little bit lower. I know, brother, this is the Eden. Trust me, I wish I was too. It's like it. Right? So today's lecture is going to be about how colonization divided Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. So I just want to give a little insight of what we'll be reviewing today. We're going to go into history, a select time in history where Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Indians were colonized. We're going to define what colonization means. We're going to define who the colonizer is. And we're also going to define who the colonized are. You understand? So that's what today's presentation is. We're going to go over history. We're going to go over certain key figures in history, certain people in history who are known to be colonizers. You understand? And we're going to shed light on the truth of how the devil destroyed us as a people. How our oppressor is nothing but a colonizer and he knows nothing else. His culture is to destroy, colonize, destroy, colonize. That's all he knows. You understand? Let me get that next slide up. Who is that right there? Right? Michael Myers, right?
Right.
Well, who is it? Michael Myers. When people think of murderers, killers, right? Maniacs, they think of Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, Chucky. Next slide. Next slide. Or they might think of Freddy Krueger as the face of evil. Right? Something cruel and disgusting. Something evil. Next slide. But this is what true evil looks like.
That's right.
This is what this is evil incarnate.
That's right.
This is a man by the name of Christopher Columbus,
Right.
who is celebrated by European scholars as a great navigator of the transatlantic.
Right.
You understand? Ocean, of the Atlantic Ocean. And he's known and celebrated for his 4 voyages across the ocean blue. But we're going to shed light on who this man really was and how he destroyed the indigenous peoples of the lands he so-called discovered. You know the lie that they teach in school is that he discovered America. That's the lie they teach. But the truth is he never even touched North America.
Right.
He never even touched North America. This man is the devil incarnate, man.
That's right.
This man is the devil. Give me the next slide. Christopher Columbus, also known as Cristobal Colon, when Columbus first set foot on Hispaniola, he encountered a population of indigenous peoples, right? The indigenous peoples that Cristobal Colon or Christopher Columbus came across during his 4 voyages were the White Indians, the Taino Indians, and the Carib Indians, hence Caribbean. A friendly and welcoming group. They willingly traded jewelry, animals, and supplies with the sailors. They were very, quote, this is Christopher Columbus's quote, they were very well built, with very handsome bodies, and very good faces, Columbus wrote in his diary. They do not carry arms or know them. They would make good slaves. That's just to give, we're going to give true insight on who this man really is, right? As you see in the bullet point, his voyages across the Atlantic paved the way for European colonization and exploitation of the Americas. When I say the Americas, I'm talking about North America, Mesoamerica, or Central, Meso means middle, Central America, South America, the Caribbean islands. Hispaniola today is Haiti and the DR, the Dominican Republic.
Right.
And Christopher Columbus, give me the next slide. Here's a map illustrating the different voyages of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus wanted to open up more trade routes for the Spanish crown. And so what he did was, he ended up voyaging to not only Cuba, but like I stated earlier, Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, different Caribbean islands, the coast of Central America, you understand? And partially the coast of South America. And when he encountered these islands, he encountered a very peaceable people, the indigenous of the land, whom he deemed Arawak, Taino, and Caribs. You understand? And what he did not know was that these were God's chosen people. These were God's chosen people. We're going to look at how he treated those people who were on these lands before him. It was our land. And he claimed it in the name of Spain. Right? Give me the next slide, please, Bubble Shop. Columbus had two goals in the Caribbean: to find gold and slaves. This is the truth about Christopher Columbus. Columbus returned home to Spain and came back to the Caribbean with 17 ships and 1,200 men. His men traveled from island to island, taking Indians as captives. Because when Christopher Columbus first came to the Caribbeans, he only came with not even 100 men, 100 Spaniards with him. So what he did was, he came, and then he went back to Spain and told King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who were Catholic monarchs of Spain at the time, that there were people on islands nearby. Right? And so what he did was, when he first went back to Spain, he brought Arawak and Taino Indians with him, and he left them there so that they could learn Spanish, so that he could bring them back to the islands with the indigenous, so that they can translate for Christopher Columbus. In a large slave raid, Columbus and his men rounded up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, dominantly that would be the Simeonites today, and put them in pens. They selected what they considered the best natives and loaded them onto ships back to Spain. 200 approximately died en route. After the survivors were sold as slaves in Spain, Columbus later wrote, this is a direct quote from Christopher Columbus: "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." This is very important to understand, Salakia. This is very important to understand the theme of this lecture. This statement made by Christopher Columbus. He made slaves of an innocent people. These people didn't want to be slaves. They didn't ask for you to educate them on Christianity. But you see, he said, let us in the name of the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity doctrine is a doctrine staple in Christianity. Next slide. So we're going to give more insight on who this man really is. Go ahead, give me the next slide. Now this is an excerpt from the diary of Christopher Columbus, because when Christopher Columbus went on various voyages, he journaled them. These are the facts. He journaled them. And then let's take a look at what he said. They, the indigenous people of the land, brought us parrots and balls of cotton, and spears, and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them. This is the 14th century. We're talking 1492 up to like 1506. You understand? The late 1400s. They do not bear arms and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine slaves. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. That was the mindset of Christopher Columbus, was to come to a people who he deemed uncivilized because he wasn't the indigenous, the Arawak, the Taino, the Carib Indians. weren't Spaniard enough to his liking. So he said they're uncivilized savages. And so he said they would make good slaves. Next slide. In this book, which is entitled A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, there was a priest by the name of Bartolome de las Casas who ventured with Christopher Columbus on various voyages to these islands, the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. And he gave an eyewitness account. He chronicled everything that he saw on these voyages, right? The Devastation of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. Give me the next slide. We're going to look at a few quotes of his, right? This is what he said. And the Christian conquistadors, with their horses, swords, and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. He said massacres. You understand what a massacre is? They attacked the towns and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed. Not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces, as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. This was the true nature of who most historians would agree that Columbus was the first conquistador. He was the first conquistador. Conquistador means to conquer. We'll come back to that in just a second. They laid bets as to who, which with one stroke of the sword could split a man in two, or cut off his head, or spill out his entrails with a single stroke of the pike. The Spaniards would make fun and sport of the Native Americans, the indigenous brothers and sisters of the land of Central America, South America, you understand, in the islands, the Caribbean islands, the Bahamas. Let's get a little bit more of what he said. In the red highlights right here. They took infants from their mother's breast, snatching them by the legs, and pitching them head first against the crags, or snatched them by the arms, and threw them into the rivers, roaring with laughter, and saying as the babies fell into the water, "Boil there, you offspring of the devil," man. These men were under the charge of Christopher Columbus. And you know the Bible says a little something like, as the ruler of the people is, so will the people be. Right. That's Christopher Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors. Devils, man. They were evil towards our people. This is the history that they don't want us to know. They don't teach us this in school, right? We're going to look at this highlighting down at the bottom in blue, right? Hold on 1 second, brother. To others, they attached straw or wrapped their whole bodies in straw and set them on fire. With still others, all those they wanted to capture alive, they cut off their hands and hung them around the victim's neck, saying, "Go now, carry the message," meaning take the news to the Indians who have fled to the mountains, because you had a lot of brothers, a lot of indigenous natives who fled, who knew that they weren't a match with the conquistadors, with the Spanish. So they fled. And so the Spanish conquistadors knew that. Give me the next slide. Right? This is another quote from Bartolome de las Casas showing you how the Spaniards came to what they believed the New World and wanted to claim it as their own. You understand? For the Spanish crown. Quote, they usually dealt with the chiefs and nobles in the following way. They made a grid of rods which they placed on forked sticks, then lashed the victims to the grid and lighted a smoldering fire underneath, so that little by little, as those captives screamed in despair and torment, their souls would leave them. The Spanish practiced burning natives alive. That's the true history of Christopher Columbus, but it gets a lot deeper. Give me the next slide. Now this man right here, Michael de Cornejo, who was also a childhood friend of Christopher Columbus, who went with Christopher Columbus on his second voyage, he describes in a letter how he raped a native woman. We're going to read it, right? This is the words of Michael de Cornejo, right? Quote, while I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman whom the said Lord Admiral gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her, and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling, meaning she didn't consent, and so treated me with her nails that I wish I had never begun. This sister was fighting for her life. You understand? She was unwilling and so treated me with her nails that I wish I had never begun. But to cut a long story short, I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly. You hear that? He whipped this sister soundly because she didn't want to have intercourse with this man. So he began to whip her. And she let forth such incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually we came to such terms. I assure you that you would have thought that she had been brought up in a school for wars. And no, the Lord Admiral gave this man that indigenous woman. And the Lord Admiral at the time was Christopher Columbus. Next slide. Christopher Columbus practiced rape. It's also stated in history that Christopher Columbus made 9 and 10-year-old girls, indigenous 10-year-old girls, prostitutes for the Spanish. Sickening. So we're going to go a little southwest, maybe 10 years later. So we were at 1492. Now we're in the early 1500s. There's an empire known as the Aztec Empire, right? The Aztecs were the people who dominated northern Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest in the early 15th and 16th century. The Aztecs eventually settled on several small islands in Lake Texaco, where in 1325 they founded the town of Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City. Fearless warriors, pragmatic builders, the Aztecs created an empire during the 15th century that were surpassed in size in the Americas only by that of the Incas in Peru. We'll touch on them a little bit later. But the Incas were a people who were very civilized. The Aztecs, the now Mexicans, the tribe of Isupk, were a people who were very civilized. They had an agriculture system. They had an economic system. They had markets. They practiced hygiene. They were clean. You understand? But then, next slide. So right here, just to give you an illustration, this is, okay, so you got North America, you come down a little bit, you have the Aztec Empire, with the Aztec Empire, modern day Mexico, or northern Mexico, you understand? And the neighbors were the Mayas, you understand? Dominantly the Belizeans, Guatemalans, the tribe of Zebulon, right? Keep going. So we're going to give a little insight of who these Aztecs were. Now there's something known as the Aztec codexes, right? And the Aztecs would illustrate life events that pertain to the Aztecs and document them in what we can define as manuscripts or books or codexes, right? Before the Spanish conquest, the Aztecs and their neighbors in and around the Valley of Mexico relied on painted books and records to document many aspects of their lives. Painted manuscripts contain information about their history, science, land tenure, tribute, and sacred rituals. You understand? It is also documented that the emperor of the last emperor of the Aztec Empire, Montezuma, who you may be familiar with, he had a library of these books. But guess what happened to him? The Spanish burned them. The Spanish burned them all, except about 5 to 10 books that made it out alive, so to speak. Continue. Here are some of these books. I just want to show you the culture of the so-called Aztecs, right? Or they call themselves the Mexica. They really, being in the truth, the tribe of I.S.U.P.K. They spoke the Nahuatl language, you see? And they would paint their culture in these manuscripts or these books. These are some of the very few books that survived. Next slide. And they all tell a story, right? This is the Aztec emperor observing the heavens. Don't tell me that Issacharites aren't Israelites. You know what the Bible says about Issachar. You understand? This is an Aztec painted this. You understand? This is pre-Columbian. Read. Next slide. All right, I'm in camp mode. Right? This is to show you how they used to dress. Right? You see how the sisters used to dress? They were modest. Right? Brothers, you have warriors that dress differently. Right? I mean, this is history in our faces. This survived miraculously. Right? Next slide. These are the warriors of the Aztec Empire. Right? These paintings are 500 years old. These paintings are 500 years old, man. Right? Christopher Columbus and the different Spanish conquistadors said that these people weren't civilized. I'm trying to understand where. Right? Next slide. Right? You see the brothers with the garments on. Right? Now, a lot of historians debate what all of these mean, but because all of the records aren't in English, it's up in the air for debate, right? But I just wanted to show you that the Aztecs documented their history and culture in manuscripts. Next slide. These are Mexicans. Now, this is also in the manuscripts of the Aztecs, the Codex of the Aztecs. What does that look like? That looks like a Spaniard with conquistadors backing him and Aztecs greeting this specific individual. We're going to shed light on who this specific individual is in just a moment. Next slide. Right? Now you see more conquistadors. These are telling stories. You know how they say a picture is worth 1,000 words? This is the very essence of that statement. You see? You see the conquistadors with their iron all over their bodies. The natives knew nothing about that. You understand? Right? You see the Spaniard flag with the eagle on it. Right? Give me the next slide. Right? This is also showing how the natives would have to bring a certain amount of gold in a form of tribute to the Spanish who were colonizing them. And if they didn't bring the quota that they were given, they would be murdered. And even if they brought the quota, they still would be murdered without provocation. Right? This is history. Next slide. Now, the man who was responsible for overthrowing the Aztec Empire was a man by the name of Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez, just to give you a little bit of history about this man and his background, he was a poor Spaniard. He came up in the more rural, poorer areas of Spain, and he heard of the voyages, the successful voyages and the success of Christopher Columbus, and he decided, I want to be rich. I want fame. Right? I want to make a name for myself. So he got him some navigators, because he wasn't a navigator, he was a conquistador. You understand? So Hernan Cortez, a Spanish conquistador who led an expedition that caused the fall of the Aztec Empire and brought large portions of what is now mainland Mexico under the rule of the King of Castile in the early 16th century. Cortez was part of the generation of Spanish explorers and conquistadors who began the first phase of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Right? Hit me with the next slide. Now, the account goes as such. Hernan Cortez and roughly 500 Spaniards come to the coast of Mexico, and they're greeted by Montezuma and different Aztec Indians, so-called Aztec Indians. Now, Montezuma presented Hernan Cortez with many gifts of gold, silver, pearls, fine linen, because Montezuma was under the impression that Cortez and the Spaniards were gods. You understand? So Montezuma brought gifts. And the reason why Montezuma thought they were, or could possibly be gods, is because the Aztecs had a religion where there's this specific being by the name of Quetzalcoatl who was supposed to return, and he would be shiny and have a pale face, right? And so Montezuma thought in his mind, this got to be Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. You understand? But come to find out, the Aztecs, through maybe 2 or 3 weeks, started to question that these were gods because they saw that these men did the same things as them. They got sick, they coughed, they can't be gods, they bleed, right? They hunger, right? Next slide. Next slide. Right? So this is from the book The Heritage of World Civilizations, and page 522. In 1519, Hernan Cortez landed in Mexico with about 500 men and a few horses. He opened communication with nearby communities and then with Montezuma, the Aztec emperor. Montezuma may initially have believed Cortez to be the god Quetzalcoatl, who, according to legend, had been driven away centuries earlier but had promised to return. Whatever the reason, Montezuma hesitated to confront Cortez, attempting at first to appease him with gifts of gold that only whetted Spanish appetites. And there's a famous line in history when Montezuma presented gifts with to Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez asked Montezuma, "Do you have more gold?" To which Montezuma responded, "Yes." And it went all downhill from there. Right? We're going to start right here. His forces then marched on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City, where Montezuma welcomed him. Cortez soon seized Montezuma, making him a prisoner in his own capital. Montezuma died in unexplained circumstances, and the Aztecs' wary acceptance to the Spaniards turned to open hostility. The Spaniards were driven out of Tenochtitlan and nearly wiped out, but they ultimately returned and laid siege to the city. So what happened was that the Aztecs began to wage war with the conquistadors. This is early 1500s. But the conquistadors began to realize they were no match numerically for the Aztecs. You understand? We're talking about millions of Aztecs versus a few hundred conquistadors. But Hernan Cortez did something very strategic. See, the Aztec Empire was a culmination of various indigenous neighbors. You understand? And these indigenous neighbors outside of the Aztec Empire had to pay tribute to the Aztecs. But they didn't like that. And Hernan Cortez got caught wind that there were indigenous tribes who hated the fact that they paid tribute to the Aztecs. So what happened was Hernan Cortez went to those indigenous tribes and made a deal with them. Next slide. As you see in this painting right here, you see Hernan Cortez, right, and different Spanish conquistadors making a deal with different indigenous tribes, such as the Chicala and various other tribes who hated the fact that they paid tribute to the Aztecs and weren't as successful and powerful as the Emperor Montezuma. So Cortez went and gathered troops and armies of the different indigenous and used them against the Aztecs. Right? The Aztec Empire was the most successful of surrounding indigenous people. So much so, other indigenous people paid tribute to the Aztecs, as I noted. This created envy and jealousy between the Aztecs and the outside indigenous tribes. Cortez convinced the indigenous people outside of the Aztecs to aid him in waging war against the Aztecs. Cortez was able to communicate with the indigenous tribes because he had an indigenous wife. Her name was La Malinche, right? Who was able to speak different languages and use her to convince the indigenous to side with Cortez in Spain. Right? Give me the next slide. Now, La Malinche is a very controversial woman in Aztec or Mexican history and both Spaniard history. Remember those codexes we talked about earlier? This is illustrating how this woman, this native indigenous woman, who is now the wife of Hernan Cortez, who was once a prisoner of Hernan Cortez used this woman because the Spanish couldn't communicate with the indigenous on their own. So we got a native who could. And she was the middleman, so to speak, to convince the other indigenous tribes to side with Cortez and come against the Aztec Empire. Next slide. Here's another illustration showing, listen, it's in our face. Hernan Cortez and Conquistadors versus the Aztecs, but look who's on the side of the Conquistadors. This is pivotal to understanding how colonization works. Right? We'll take questions at the end. Right? Give me the next slide. Right? Now, we briefly summarized how Hernan Cortez overthrew the Aztecs. Right? And we're going to come back to him because it's a bigger plot to it. But down south, there was another empire, which is known as the largest indigenous pre-Columbian empire, known to man, known as the Inca Empire. Right? The Inca Empire was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The civilization emerged in the 13th century and lasted until it was conquered by the Spanish in 1572. Right? The administrative, political, and military center of the empire was located in Cusco, right? Modern-day Peru. The Inca Empire dominantly was made up of your modern-day Peruvians, who are Israelites, right? Ecuadorians, Chileans, right? Give me the next slide. Right? Now, to give you a better understanding of how large this empire was, the Inca Empire, right? They ranged from Ecuador, northern Ecuador, southern Colombia, right? Approximately all the way down to central Chile, right? The Aztecs only ruled northern, a little bit northern Mexico. You understand? The Inca Empire was grand. Give me the next slide. Right? Millions of Peruvians. These are illustrations of how these brothers and sisters looked, how they dressed, right? They weren't naked running around as Nat Geo would like you to believe. That's a lie, right? Give me the next slide. Right? Here is in a museum of Peru. They were displaying how the Incas, Inca means king, how the Incas would dress, right? And the Inca Empire was known for being a people of being very royal, right? They had a lot of gold. Their thrones were made of gold. Their armbands were made of gold. Their medallions were made of gold. Their headpieces were made of gold. Their knives, their forks and spoons, gold, right? Very rich culture, right? Next slide. As you see here in the museum, this is some of the gold that was obtained by the Spanish, led by the man that we will soon discuss, right? You see how rich this is. I mean, gold gloves. What you gonna do with that? I don't know, but it's amazing. Gold. Next slide. Right? Gold headpieces, gold breastplates, gold nose rings, gold earrings. Right? The Inca Empire, that landmass was very resourceful for gold, silver, right? That's also where you get cocoa from. South America and Amazon, right? Different herbs and spices, tropical birds, exotic birds. Next slide. Right? But see, Hernan Cortez, or Hernando Cortez, as he states here, we Spaniards know a sickness of the heart that only gold can cure. Remember, the head man in charge who opened the doorway for the exploitation and colonization of the indigenous people, Christopher Columbus, he had two main motives: gold and slaves, and in doing so, would open up more trade routes for the Spanish crown. Next slide. Now here is another illustration showing a man by the name of Francisco Pizarro. Just like Christopher Columbus dominated the Caribbean islands, the island of Hispaniola, Cuba, the coast partially of Central America, right? You had Hernan Cortez overthrow the Aztec Empire. Give me the next slide. The man that overthrew or led the charge of the overthrowing of the Inca Empire was a man by the name of Francisco Pizarro. Now I'm giving you a little bit of history of all these men, and we're going to bring them all back up in just a second. Because I have to bring these men up to show you who we're going to be discussing and how evil and cruel these people were when they were. They didn't just ask for gold and was given it. No, they got the gold. They claimed South America as Spanish territory. They did those things, but how did they do it? That's what we're going to discuss, right? Francisco Pizarro was a Spanish conquistador best known for his expeditions that led to the Spanish conquest of Peru. Right? Give me the next slide. Right? When Pizarro first arrived, he was greeted. Now, keep in mind, Francisco Pizarro was also the cousin of Hernan Cortez, so I guess you could say evil runs in the family. When Pizarro first arrived, he was greeted and welcomed. He then returned to Spain and sought permission from the Spanish crown to claim this newfound land in the name of Spain. However, the few years while the Spanish weren't present, right, as Francisco Pizarro goes back and he's trying to get permission to go back and dominate Peru, right? However, the few years while the Spanish weren't present, a smallpox epidemic broke out, causing almost 70% of the Incas to die. The smallpox came from when Francisco Pizarro and his few hundred men came to the shores of South America. The Emperor Y.A.HANNA and his heir died from smallpox. This then created a feud between the other two sons of the now dead emperor. When Pizarro returned, he found the Inca in the middle of a civil war and used that to his advantage and conquered the Incas. You see as an illustration of northern, because now, and there was the Inca Empire, while the Spanish weren't there, a smallpox epidemic broke out. The emperor died from the smallpox. The rightful heir died from smallpox. So his two other sons, I want to be the emperor. No, I want to be the emperor. So that caused a division, just like in the Bible, right? Some of the Peruvians, some of the Incas sided with one man, some of them sided with the other. And it caused a civil war and caused millions of Incas to die. Give me the next slide. The two Inca emperors was named by Huáscar and Atahualpa. These were the two men who were going back and forth while the Spanish and Francisco Pizarro weren't present. They're just killing each other. They're going back and forth, right? Millions of brothers and sisters dying in the middle of an epidemic of smallpox. You understand? Right? Give me the next slide. And so what happened was between when Francisco Pizarro came back toward the end of that civil war, and then he took advantage strategically and conquered it. Now we've mentioned a lot about conquistadors. I just want to shed a little bit of light of who conquistadors are. Right? The conquistadors were the knights, soldiers, and explorers of the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. During the Age of Discovery, conquistadors sailed beyond Europe to the Americas and various other locations, conquering territory and opening trade routes. They brought colonialism to much of the world for Spain and Portugal in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Give me the next slide. Like I mentioned earlier, conquistadors means conqueror in Spanish, right? Here are the motives of the conquistadors, right? Wealth, power, prestige, spreading Christian religion. What did Christopher Columbus bring the slaves in the name of? In the name of the Holy Trinity, right? Next slide. Here's another illustration showing these devils just stealing all the gold at their will, right? But we're going to get how they got that gold. Give me the next slide, right? Now you see here, I put images of the different Spanish conquistadors, navigators, and explorers, and I'm posing a question. What did these Spanish navigators and conquistadors have in common? What did Hernan Cortez have in common with Francisco Pizarro, Hernando del Soto, right? Christopher Columbus? What do all these men have in common? Give me the next slide. something called encomienda. Can everybody say encomienda? Encomienda. This was a system used by the Spanish on the indigenous. We're going to get some more information on this. Give me the next slide. In the 1500s, Spain systematically conquered parts of North, Central, and South America, as well as the Caribbean. With indigenous governments such as efficient as the Inca Empire in ruins, the Spanish conquistadors needed to find a way to rule their new subjects. The encomienda system was put in place in several areas, most importantly in Peru because it was the grandest of them all. Under the encomienda system, prominent Spaniards were entrusted with native Peruvian communities in exchange for the stolen labor of indigenous people and tribute. The Spanish lord would provide protection and education. Right? This is critical to understanding colonization. In reality, however, the encomienda system was fully mass enslavement and led to some of the worst horrors of the colonial era. Give me the next slide. This is how the encomienda system works. The word encomienda comes from the Spanish word encomendar, meaning to entrust, meaning the Spanish, under the Spanish crown, different Spanish settlers, priests, navigators, and conquistadors were entrusted to make subjects of the indigenous peoples and natives of these lands now discovered, and in return, make them slaves and make them gather all the gold and bring it to the feet of Spain, and in return, educate them and teach them about Christianity. Christopher Columbus and the Caribbean, Spanish conquistadors, settlers, priests, and colonial officials were given a grant of land. These lands were quite often vast. The land included any indigenous cities, towns, communities, or families that lived there. The indigenous people were supposed to provide tribute in the form of gold or silver, crops, and food. Animals such as exotic birds, llamas, or anything else that the land produced. These are things Spain didn't have. Spain didn't know what a toucan bird was. They didn't know what the cocoa bean was. They had never seen llamas. You understand? These are things native to the South Americans. The indigenous people could also be made to work for a certain amount of time, say on a sugarcane plantation or in a mine. In return, the encomendero, right, or the overseer, was responsible for the well-being of the enslaved people and was to see to it that they were converted and educated about Christianity. Give me the next slide. Right? The Spanish crown reluctantly approved of the granting of the encomiendas because it needed to reward the conquistadors and establish a system of governance in the newly conquered territories. Right? The system essentially made landed nobility out of men whose only skills were murder, mayhem, and torture. Meaning Spain put in charge murderers over the indigenous people. It also swiftly led to abuses. Right? Overseers or encomenderos made unreasonable demands of the native Peruvians and indigenous people of the nearby islands who lived on their lands, working them excessively or demanding tribute of crops that could not be grown on the land. These problems appeared quickly. The first New World haciendas granted in the Caribbean often had only 50 to 100 indigenous people, and even on such a small scale, it wasn't long before the encomenderos had virtually enslaved their subjects. Next slide. All right. In Peru, where encomiendas were granted on the ruins of the rich and mighty Inca Empire, the abuses soon reached epic proportions. The encomenderos there showed an inhuman indifference to the suffering of the families of their encomiendas, or the indigenous people. They did not change the quotas, meaning the amount of gold or the amount of resources they were supposed to bring in at the end of the month, even when crops failed or disaster struck. Many native Peruvians were forced to choose between fulfilling quotas and starving to death, or failing to meet quotas, and facing the often lethal punishment of the overseers, men and women were forced to work in mines for weeks at a time, often by candlelight in deep shafts. You understand? Those are the harsh conditions that they slaved us in. Right? Next slide. Right? Now I'll bring all of that up to this point here. Cruelty precedes colonization. We see here an excerpt from the Bible, Mark chapter 3, verse 27, where Christ said, "No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house." We're going to look and observe in history how our strong man was bound and how they spoiled our goods. Give me the next slide. Now we're going to look at the cruelty of the conquistadors, right? What length was our oppressor willing to go in order to ensure that in future generations, large-scale rebellion would not be a concern? Next slide. Here's Deuteronomy 28:49. "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand." When the Spanish conquistadors first came to the indigenous didn't know what the hell the Spanish were talking about.
Right.
Right? Deuteronomy 28:50, "A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young." This is what Moses prophesied to the Israelites, what would happen if we did not observe the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. A nation would come up against us, as swift as the eagle flieth, and would destroy us, both old and young. Verse 51, "And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed. Which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or flax of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee." And that's exactly where we're going to look at how the Spanish destroyed the indigenous of the South Americas, the Inca Empire, the Aztec Empire, the native, the Arawak Indians, the Taino Indians, the Carib Indians. Next slide. So let's look at some of these cruel practices. This is from American Holocaust by David E. Stannard, right? And this is a quote from Bartolome de las Casas, who we discussed earlier. He says here, "The Spaniards took babies from their mother's breast, grabbing them by the feet and smashing their heads against rocks. How inhumane do you have to be to do such a thing? To grab a child, a baby, an infant, by the ankles, with the family bystanding and watching you dash their heads against the stone. They built a long gibbet, long enough for the toes to touch the ground and prevent strangling, and hang 13 natives at a time in, quote, honor of Christ, our Savior, and the 12 apostles. The straw was wrapped around their torn bodies, and they were burned alive." Next slide. This is what the Spanish did, right? The Spanish also were known for mutilating the indigenous. The conquistadors were known to mutilate the native population, often for no reason and with no provocation. De las Casas wrote, "With my own eyes, I saw Spaniards cut off the nose, hands, and ears of Indians, male and female, without provocation, merely because it pleased them to do it." Next slide. Back in the book American Holocaust, right? These accounts were given by Bartolome de las Casas and also Bernal del Castillo. Bernal del Castillo, he ventured with Hernan Cortez and overthrowing the Aztec Empire, and this is what he chronicled or recorded. They would cut an Indian's hands and leave them dangling by a shred of skin. And they would test their swords with their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing off of heads. They would line indigenous people up. And they would make sport, like I mentioned earlier, of the indigenous people. This is real history. And they would test their strength and see if they can cut the native's head smooth off. How evil. One crow captain traveled over many leagues, opening, and capturing the Indians he could find. Since the Indians would not tell him who their lord was, he cut off the hands of some and threw others to the dogs, and they were torn to pieces. The Spanish were known for bringing war dogs, wolfhounds, and sticking them on the indigenous peoples. And these dogs would eat us alive after we done had our nose cut off, our bodies mutilated, our hands cut, dangling. Next slide. Right? More information from this book. Right? Direct quotes, first-hand account. This ain't I heard they did this. This is what they saw. They threw into those holes all the Indians they could capture of every age and kind. Pregnant and confined women. Children, old men were left on the stakes until the pits were filled. The Spanish would have the indigenous make big holes in the ground. Big holes in the ground. And they would put wooden stakes, sharp stakes in the middle. And they would plant them. They would have the indigenous plant them in these holes. And then they would throw them in there for fun, for sport. You understand? The rest they killed with the lances and daggers and threw them to their war dogs, who tore them up and devoured them. These are God's chosen people they did this to.
Right.
You understand? They did this to our Zebulonite brothers and sisters. Right. Our I.S.U.P.K brothers and sisters. Right. Our Israelite brothers and sisters.
Right.
And you think God ain't going to have nothing to say about that?
That's right.
Next slide. This is also what they used to do. This is sick. When the Spaniards had collected a great deal of gold from the Indians, they shut them up in 3 big houses, crowding in as many as they could. Then set fire to the houses, burning alive all that were in them. Yet those Indians had given no cause or made any resistance. So the Indians would pay their tribute. You have 50 native or indigenous Indians pay their tribute. They met their monthly quota. And then the Spanish would gather them in a house, lock them in, and burn them alive, and listen to them scream. This is the history of the Spanish conquistadors. Right? It's sickening. Next slide. Right? I want to pay this is from page 10. We're going to look at the green highlight, right, of American Holocaust, the book we've been reviewing. It says, just 21 years after Columbus' first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshima. Anybody know what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki? This was like child's play compared to what happened on the islands of Hispaniola and the Caribbean. So our indigenous brothers and sisters, millions of natives died. Next slide. Right, here's an illustration of how the conquistadors further oppressed our brothers and sisters. Right, they made slaves of them. The transatlantic slave trade started with the northern kingdom of Israelites. You understand? Next slide. But now, all of that information, we come to this question, and we went over all of that to define what colonization actually is. What is colonization? Next slide. So, when Officer Karyash brought this topic to me, how colonization divided us, blacks, Hispanics, and Native Indians, I wanted to, of course, after I got off the phone with him, I wanted to look up what colonization means, what it means to colonize, what's a colony. And I'm looking up the definitions, and it didn't help at all. Merriam-Webster said, colonize, to establish a colony. Damn. That don't even make no sense, right? So we're going to define colonization, and Merriam-Webster owes Commander YAHANNA a check after this lecture. Next slide. Right? So in order to understand colonization, now I want you to keep in mind everything that we went through, because it's important to understand these points. with Hernan Cortez and the Aztec Empire, Francisco Pizarro, the Inca Empire, right? Christopher Columbus and the indigenous of those regions that he visited or discovered during his 4 voyages, right? Next slide. So in order to understand how colonization works, we have to understand how a virus works.
Damn.
You gotta understand how a virus works. Next slide. Viruses are deadly. Why viruses are deadly and how they work. This is science. A virus enters the body and masks itself as something good or beneficial to the body.
Damn.
The virus then infects the good cells in our bodies. Keep in mind, those other indigenous tribes, Hernan Cortez went and got and formed an alliance with them and came against the Aztecs. They invade living normal cells and use those cells to multiply and produce other viruses like themselves. Then a virus eats the body from the inside out, eventually until only the virus remains. Your body reacts, and as a result, you become sick. Next slide. So colonization, finally defined, is when 2 nations come in contact with each other. One nation or race begin imposing their will on the other, masked as something beneficial. The one who imposes their will in the form of their culture, language, religion, and way of life is the colonizer. That was the Spanish. The race of people who are infected are now colonized. The infection that the indigenous natives were infected with was Christianity.
That's right.
It was Catholicism.
Right.
It was white Jesus.
Right.
The natives rejected the ways of our oppressor.
Right.
You understand? But over time, it was beat into us. You saw how they used to this is what they used to do. I didn't put it on the screen, but this is what they used to do. They would not only rape our women, but they would kill send over to a hut of an indigenous family. Right? I want you to imagine it. This is actual history. These are the facts. They would go in, they would murder the husband in front of the wife and child, right? And they would snatch the child from the mother's breast as the mother was breastfeeding. This is sick. And they would hold the face of the indigenous woman and make them watch them grab their indigenous babies, our brothers and sisters, newborn babies, ankle by ankle, and rip them in half. That's what they did. That's what they did. They drove fear into the indigenous people. And in the process of doing so, they taught them Christianity. They taught them worship us. When you pray, imagine us. White Jesus. The Holy Trinity. You can eat whatever you want. Everything that transpired into today, blacks, Hispanics, we don't understand that we're sick. Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans are sick. And it goes back as far as when the Spanish encountered the Arrowback Indians, the Taino Indians.
That's right.
You understand? For you to believe that God is okay with you eating anything, and there's laws in the Bible saying don't eat this, you are sick. You're infected. You are colonized. But see, in I.S.U.P.K, under Commander YAHANNA, we are not colonized.
That's right.
We put on the spirit of the, get the most high a hand. You understand? Get the Shai a hand. And Commander YAHANNA a hand for holding on to the truth and making it accessible to us now in 2021. Next slide. This is Jeremiah 17:4. And thou, even thyself, shalt discontinue from thy inheritance that I gave you. This was a prophecy in the Bible, man. And the reason why we discontinue from our heritage, it discontinued in the form of us it getting beat out of us, man. That's just the truth. We got beat out of us.
Right.
I mean, we went through the history, we went through how they treated us. And we could have went back, like I'm discussing with Kardashian, we could have went back to Alexander and the Hellenization of Israelites in Israel.
Right.
We could have went back when Herod, who was an Idumean, he wasn't an Israelite, he had provinces in Israel. He ruled over the Jews.
Right.
He put eagles in our holy places. He put Roman symbols in our holy places. Antiochus IV Antiochus Epiphanes IV sacrificed swine on our holy altars.
Right.
Those are the facts. You understand? They colonized us back then. You see? But then we wanted to shed light on this time period in history because October 12th is coming up, and they're going to sugarcoat all the evil that Christopher Columbus did. All the heinous crimes, all the evil that led to the subjugation, the colonization, right, of our brothers and sisters. Next slide. Right? And this again is just illustrating how millions, I have to emphasize, millions of brothers lost their lives, man. They lost their lives at the hands of the Spanish conquistadors. Millions died from disease, smallpox, rape, right? They made merchandise of our daughters, right? Next slide. Right, so now what we're going to do is jump up a little bit in history and go into the time where the Native Americans were colonized, when the Spanish first came to the North Americans, right? And the information, I mean, it's quite disgusting. It's quite disgusting how they treated the natives of this land. So I'm going to pass the mic to Police Officer Parrilla. I'm Police Officer. I want to thank you for your time.
Police Officer of 1,000 Karyash, as you already know, what we about to touch on is the North American Indian, the enslavement of the Native Americans of this land, the inhabitants of this land. For how many years, for how many months, for how many decades have you been told that the North American Indians aren't Israelites? For how many years have you been told that the North American Indians haven't suffered through what the black man has suffered through? They haven't suffered through what the Hispanic man has suffered through. Here we're going to show you here today that there is a blatant lie. This is what you got to understand. The North American Indian has been enslaved for over 500 years and been colonized for over 500 years. They have been subjugated under Christianity for over 500 years here in America, has suffered the same as their black brothers, has suffered the same as their Hispanic brothers. And the same way they're suffered is why they had to divide you. And that's what we're going to go into right now. The North American Indians, or the Native Americans as they want to call them, pushed us out of our land and places we deem sacred and forced us on reservations. The same way they threw black people in the ghettos, the same way they threw the Hispanics in the barrios, and the same way they threw the North American Indians on the reservation.
Right.
Millions of Native Americans died from senseless murder, disease, and much more. Indian removal acts and the Trail of Tears led by Andrew Jackson. And if you don't know who Andrew Jackson is, he is a disgusting devil, man. No different than Christopher Columbus. No different than Hernan Cortez. No different than Donald Trump.
That's right.
All of them have had the same hatred for blacks, Hispanics, and North American Indians. And that's what you're going to witness here today. If you haven't been told it before, what you're going to witness here today is the true Holocaust. For over 500 years, the North American Indian, the Hispanics, the black people here in America, you have suffered the true Holocaust. Not the Jewish man. Well, how many Jewish people died during the Holocaust? Over 11 million, they claim. Guess how many North American Indians? Over hundreds of millions. Over hundreds of millions were forced to keep Christianity. Over hundreds of millions were colonized and assimilated. And that's what we're going to go into, man. Eventually moved from mass genocide and killing us physically to killing the Indian and saving the man. What's killing the Indian and saving the man? It's the ideology of destroying the culture of the North American Indians, of destroying the culture of the Hispanics. Because like my brother, Police and Officer Thabon was going into, the Hispanics had a rich culture. The Native Americans had a rich culture. And they had to steal from you. Why? To make you a savage. They want to claim that the North American Indians are savages, when in reality they are the true savage. And we're going to show you here today. European settlers first encountered North American Indians in the 16th century. European settlers deemed the culture and lifestyles of Native Americans to be uncivilized and called us savages. Isn't that ironic?
Right.
They call the North American Indians savages. Right. The Hispanic savages. Right. They call black people super predators. But they're the ones who stole this land.
Right.
They're the ones whose hands are covered in blood, man. Right. So I ask you here today, who are the true savages? Who are the true murderers? Next slide, if you could, sir. Now, this is a topic that has been heavy in the news if you pay attention. The Native Indian boarding schools. Why has this been a heavy topic? Because over 700 children's bodies have been found in the North American Indians training school.
That's right.
Where they found the bodies of our babies, man. Right. And how come it isn't publicized? Right. How come there's no protest for us? They're protesting for the Palestinians. They're protesting for every single other nation. But where's the protesting against the Catholic Church? Where's the protesting against Christianity? When the North American Indians suffered in these places. And we're going to show you. Real quick, so give me the next slide. Kill the Indian and save the man. If you are familiar with history, if you're familiar with colonization, if you're familiar with the history of the early Americas, this phrase is common to you. Right. To kill the Indian and save the man. What does Indian mean? When they came here to the Americas and they called the native people of this land Indians, it meant savage. Right. They called the native peoples of this land Indians to call them savage. Right. So they said to themselves, we have to kill the savage, meaning what? We had to kill their culture. Right. We had to kill everything that they knew. We had to cut their hair. We had to take their language. We had to take everything they knew and make them like us. Right. And we're going to go into that. This was said by Captain Richard H. Pratt. Who's Captain Richard H. Pratt, you may ask? Next slide, if you could, sir. Who is Captain Richard H. Pratt? We're going to go into it right now. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, he's no different than Christopher Columbus, right, from Hernan Cortez, right, and Ronald Reagan, all these devils you know that have sought out to destroy blacks, Hispanics, and North American Indians. He's no different. Next slide, if you could, sir. Richard H. Pratt, born December 6, 1840. Richard Henry Pratt was an American general who is best known as the founder and longtime superintendent of the influential Kearsarge Indian Industrial School at Kearsarge, Pennsylvania. He associated with the first recorded use of the word racism, which he used in 1902 to criticize racial segregation. Pratt is also known for using the phrase, kill the Indian and save the man, in reference to the ethos of the Kearsarge Indian Industrial School and efforts to indoctrinate and educate Native American Indians. Whenever you hear genocide, whenever you hear death, what do you think of? You think about the Holocaust, don't you? That's what you hear about. But guess who you don't think about? You don't think about the North American Indians that were forced to endure suffering, man. That were raped, that were molested, that had their culture ripped from them, that were beaten to death, man. You didn't think about the Hispanics that were thrown into the missionary systems down in California. That's what you don't think of. And that's what we need to touch on today. Why? Because colonization divided blacks, Latinos, and Native American Indians. Give me the next slide if you don't mind, sir. Now the boarding schools. Why is the boarding school so important, you may ask? Because the boarding schools is no different than the slave plantations. Right. The boarding schools is no different through the Catholic missionaries that they threw our Hispanic brothers in, man. Right. So the Native American boarding schools, also known as Indian residential schools, were established in the United States during the early 19th century and mid-20th century, with a primary objective of civilizing or assimilating Native American children and youth into European culture. Yeah, they did a great way with that by killing them, by molesting them, by taking advantage of our children, man. Right. And they still doing it to this day. Right. What you seeing down there at the border with Donald Trump and with Joe Biden when he doing at the ICE detention centers is no different what they did all the way back then at the Indian residential schools. Right. All of it are excuses to molest your children. That's right. All of it are excuses to kill your babies, man. That's right. Let's continue. While destroying and vilifying Native American culture, at the same time a basic education in European American subjects was provided. These boarding schools were established by Christian missionaries or various denominators who often started schools on reservations, especially in the lightly populated areas of the West. Next slide, sir, if you could. Native Indian boarding schools. At boarding schools, staff forced indigenous students to cut their hair and use new American names. Now, I want you to think about your time in the truth. When you come in the truth, what is something we tell you? We tell you to grow your hair out. We tell you to accept your culture. We tell you you're going to get yourself a new name. Why is that? Because that's taking back your culture. Right here, if you're a brother with braids up in here, or a sister with braids, or a brother or sister with long hair in the throat, give yourselves a hand, man. Because you are a defiance of colonization. You are a defiance of white supremacy, man. Because for 500 years, they stole your hair. Why? Not because it's your hair and it's so beautiful and it's so pretty, but because it's a defiance against them, man. Because it's part of your culture. Samson had locks. All these men in the Bible had locks, had braids according to the Bible. So did the North American Indians. That's right. So did the Hispanics. So they cut their braids off. And they cut their fringes off. So they took their language. Let's continue. They forbid children from speaking their native language and observing their religious and cultural practices. And by removing them from their homes, the school disrupted students' relations with their families and other members of their tribe. They would send your children home, man, and you would not be able to recognize them. Your child you sent off and you seen go to these residential schools dragged by white devils, you would be unable to recognize them. You'd be unable to speak to them. You know how much of a crime that is? To steal someone's identity and not give them the ability to even talk to their own family, man. They want to talk about the Jewish people and about every other people on this earth except the North American Indians, or except the Hispanics. They have